European leaders meet this weekend for yet another summit focused on the Eurozone debt crisis. European Commission President José Manuel Barroso is upbeat, but Ireland has thrown a spanner in the works by calling for a referendum on the European Stability Treaty. So, what, if anything, will this summit achieve? Welcome to Agenda, and joining me this week is Stratfor founder Dr. George Friedman. George, are we anywhere near to a solution on all this, or are the Europeans just going to continue to muddle through?
The problem is to define what you're trying to solve. If what you're trying to solve is a sovereign debt problem, that's one thing. If what you're trying to solve is a banking problem, that's another thing. If what you're trying to solve is a trade imbalance problem, it's a third thing. And finally, if what you're trying to solve is an institutional problem of how these countries in Europe relate to each other, that's a fourth problem. And everyone in the financial markets have focused, quite naturally, on the financial dimension. But there are much deeper dimensions here, which is what precisely is Europe? What do Europe's countries owe to each other? What happens to sovereignty in Europe if the stronger countries are able to impose controls on the weaker countries? And how does this all play out? And so the problem here is not, as it was in the United States, a serious financial problem, compounded by some serious political questions, but a fundamental constitutional issue that raises the question, what is Europe? And I just don't think that's soluble. I don't think the Europeans have addressed that. They have wanted to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted to have sovereignty retained and yet have the benefits of union. And that really is what this crisis has shown, that you can't have both. You have to make certain decisions.
Meanwhile, we have a European summit this weekend where none of these things that you've discussed are going to be addressed, but the Irish have thrown a spanner in the works by calling for a referendum on the treaty, and other people are saying that the limit on debt must be 3%. Now, most people know that for many countries that's unobtainable.
That's why the major product of Europe today are summits. They are constantly meeting because they can't reach a settlement. And they can't reach a settlement because they want this to be just a financial crisis. They don't want to really deal with the institutional issues that have been reached. And therefore, they're looking for solutions that are unobtainable, the 3% cap. They're dealing with countries like Ireland, who I don't think are bluffing. They can't give the Europeans what they're asking for and have the government survive the public opinion. So my argument would be that certainly the Europeans are not going to be discussing the issues that I've raised this week, which is why this summit will lead nowhere, and the next summit will lead nowhere. And the fundamental problem is the Europeans will not face the fundamental problem. They will not face the issues that have to be faced. They have no way to reach a consensus on it. And so they will have endless summits interspersed by endless crises that appear to come from nowhere, but really come from this substratum of reality that the Europeans are not dealing with.
Now, let's break this down. One of the world's leading bankers, Peter Sands, who is the chief executive of Standard Chartered, has said that the huge sums of money being pumped into the European economies mean that this is all just unsustainable and are really just laying the ground for another crisis in a year's time.
Well, but I mean, his problem is that he's looking at the financial situation in isolation. If you look at the financial situation in isolation and you assume that the head of a financial institution is the person you want to listen to on the question of the European problem, then quite reasonably he's going to say this problem is going to get much worse. The problem is that the only solution he has is a politically unacceptable alternative financial policy. So you immediately get to the political problem.
Let's turn to politics, which are influencing the French elections, which are coming up soon, and where Nicolas Sarkozy, the French president, is really fighting for his political life.
The fundamental question of France is, what is France's relation to Germany? France has a trade deficit with Germany. Germany has a surplus with France. This imbalance may represent some theory of free trade, but it clearly puts the French public at a disadvantage, save that class that benefits from the trade. And therefore, you're going to have fundamental shifts and struggles within France over the future. But this doesn't have to do with the personality of Sarkozy or what Hollande says. It really has to do with the question that France has to answer. What is the French national interest? What is its relationship to Germany? And ultimately, does it benefit from Europe structured the way it currently is? And I think this election, ignoring the various headlines and statements and everything else, reflects the fact that the consensus that existed in France prior to this crisis, that in a way Sarkozy represented, is gone. The consensus on Europe, the consensus on its relation to Germany, all of these things are up in the air. It doesn't mean it'll fall apart. It doesn't mean that there'll be a break. It does mean they has to be examined. And Sarkozy is in trouble because he doesn't want to re-examine the position of France under the current circumstances. He is committed to the European project as it stands. And being committed to that project, he has enemies on the left and the right who are going to challenge him. And you can't predict an election, but potentially overwhelm him. The real issue is what happens to that group of political leaders, intellectual leaders, social leaders, who were utterly committed to the European experiment, where that European experiment at the very least requires fundamental revision, at most has failed. What happens to this class? And inevitably, this class, the more rigid it is on the European concept, the more likely they are to be weakened.
Meanwhile, Germany, which is the powerhouse of Europe, is seeing its reputation slipping.
Germany is isolated from the rest of Europe because Germany is very different than the rest of Europe. Germany is the world's second largest exporting country. As the second largest exporting country, it is the greatest beneficiary of the free trade zone. And for many countries, a free trade zone has become problematic. Germany's approach to the problem is fundamentally different to that of other countries. And as it evolves politically, the tensions between Germany and the rest of the world and the rest of Europe are going to be increasingly questionable. Also, don't assume that Merkel's position is unassailable in Germany. When you have public opinion turning against you, you have a serious potential problem. And it's not the trivial problem of whether she rises or falls or anything else. It's a question of whether the German public, given the shifts in the European system that are underway, are going to see Europe as necessary to them. And the crisis that she has is that in terms of international trade, she must have something resembling the European Union, its monetary policies, its free trade zone. On the other side of the equation, the pain of supporting Europe falls on different classes in different ways, and it really is changing it. I think what we really have to understand is that not only did this crisis originate in fundamental institutional issues, it will resolve itself by addressing those issues. And many of the politicians that we see right now as being extremely powerful, defining people, may not be very powerful in the long run. The real thing is to step back and try to see precisely how deeply the European experiment has to be changed in order to redeem it, and if those changes are tolerable by various countries and various people. So in Europe, we now have to stop using the term Europe, and we have to use the words Italy, France, Germany, Poland. These are the institutions that really matter now. The European Union itself will survive depending on the decisions made in those countries.
George Friedman, Ending Agenda, thanks very much for being with us.